All right, welcome to the home stretch. Hopefully you've caffeinated and you're ready to go for the next hour. My predecessors, the previous presenters, set quite a high bar. I'm hoping to reach that level, but certainly one of the benefits of that is that they have really created a great foundation for this discussion. I'm sorry that it's only an hour. I'm going to work really hard to get my comments in within half an hour to leave a good amount of time for us to have an open discussion. So the question I've been given is, how can water transfer mechanisms be made more effective and useful? So for purposes, just as a little bit of a side note, for purposes of my presentation, I'm going to continue to use the word transfer. Transactions may be more appropriate, water sharing may be more PC, but for continuity purposes, I'm going to go with transfers. So I actually really like the way this question was phrased. It can be read to ask about the mechanisms themselves, so what we use and how they are constructed. But it also asks about the factors that influence the function of those mechanisms, how to potentially influence those mechanisms through many of the things that we've already talked about today. For example, law, social and political dynamics. I believe Buzz refers to it as political will. Infrastructure capacity. I mean, there are a lot of the things that have already been part of this conversation, but these are critical in terms of just having that mechanism may not be enough. You have to understand the things that drive it and make it work. So I waffled a little bit in terms of how I was going to present, because there are basically two questions in here. And so ultimately I decided that I would tell some stories, give some examples that provide both some good mechanisms, well constructed, but also highlight some of these other factors and the importance of them in terms of manifesting the results that we've seen. But if there are two themes so far that I've heard today, it's complex and everyone's different. As a result, there is a lot of variability across the West, both within states and outside of them, between them. There are really different circumstances that we're having to deal with. I'm going to try very hard to talk in generalities. It's not really easy to do. Basically, most of the things that I'm going to say, you could find exceptions for. But I'm going to try to give you an overarching perspective on what prior appropriation, or the influence that prior appropriation tends to have on these transactions, and one of the reasons why it's so complex. I'm also going to focus just on surface water, in part because there's more consistency there in the underlying legal regime than there is for groundwater. There certainly have been some developments in terms of groundwater transfers, but for my purposes of the presentation today, it's going to be focused just on surface water examples. So Buzz has already given us a very great explanation in terms of prior appropriation. Reagan added a little bit more to that. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail here. But basically, west of the 100th meridian, you're talking about states that predominantly rely on the prior appropriation system for their water allocation. So first in time, first in right, I won't explain all of these details. But I think I want to make sure I note, Reagan, thank you for the reminder of the caveat, prior appropriation is sacred. But let's now talk about it. So there are two key tenets, both of which Professor Thompson has already noted, but I want to really emphasize here because they tend to influence what we can and can't do, or some of the challenges in terms of making water transactions occur. And I loved Buzz's comment earlier about don't ask your lawyer, what you can't do or what to work around, but how can we make these things happen? I think that's so important. And speaking as a lawyer, I always get a little disappointed when I hear people mention that let's just say their Office of General Counsel tells them what they can't do, and it's always restrictive. Lawyers just have this bad rap of telling no, no, no. I think our real challenge as lawyers is to identify how you can do these sorts of things. So I've loved the questions that all of you have posed so far, and I will say that has caused me to be back there frantically trying to amend my presentation to try to address some of those things and tee up some of the questions for later. Anyway, getting back to two key tenets of prior appropriation. protecting water rights of other users, and avoiding speculation. You'll often hear that referred to as the forfeiture and or abandonment doctrines, and generally speaking, use it or lose it. So for purposes of protecting other water rights, I want to dive into real quickly here a policy approach. You could lay out that you could basically put all the burden on your water right holder and say, we're going to let this transfer go through without a whole lot of procedure, and then it's up to you to sue if it's something that's a problem, if it's problematic for you, if your water right is being impaired. But states don't do that, generally speaking. They create this process and more or less require the proponent of this transfer to identify or prove that they will not be, there's little chance that they're going to be impairing other water rights. And I'll get into that in a second. Also, in much of the West, water usage data is limited. We've already talked about that a little bit. So it makes the level of scrutiny in a water right transfer quite high compared to what most people see. And as a result, this concern over what the court will find or how it will rule, including whether part of that right will be forfeited due to past usage, has given potential lessors some pause in the past. As Buzz had also mentioned, rightly or wrongly, there is still concern about forfeiture and abandonment. There are a lot of workarounds or a lot of exceptions in state law, but it is something that is on the minds of a lot of people and can be a problem when you're talking about transfers. Okay. There is... Sweet. Okay. So commonly a big part of a transfer review is determining the amount of water that can be transferred. Again, going back to this, you don't want to impact or adversely affect the other water rights in the basin. Part of that, in many cases, is identifying what your historic consumptive use is. More or less, and we've talked about it a little bit today, you might, for example, have the right to divert 10 cubic feet per second during a certain period of the year. Some of that water will be taken up by evaporation, transpiration, so what's taken up in the crop, but a good amount of it, in many cases, will run back off into the source and or make its way down into groundwater and potentially make its way back into the source. We've got Thomas's explanation of the connection of surface and groundwater so far. Sharon's comment about the conundrum of very leaky agriculture, as well as Buzz's mention of the lack of clarity in the water right. This is that lack of clarity. A lot of water rights are for the amount that you're allowed to divert. Determining all of this takes engineers, it takes lawyers, and in many cases you've got a lot of people that do not want to see your transfer happen or would like to minimize the amount of water that you can transfer as much as possible. So it creates a big challenge and it can take a long time to get through these procedures. It's expensive, time-consuming, and difficult. I want to really quickly deviate from my originally planned schedule and go into, this is one of the main things that's challenging with the questions that people have posed about water conservation and being able to transfer, lease, sell the conserved water that you have. It's the same problem. How much do you really, what have you conserved? What is water conservation? Is it the amount that you're no longer diverting? Is it the amount that you've reduced in your historic consumptive use? Is it somewhere in between? You've got instances like California, which, by the way, does have the authority or does provide the authority for water right holders to transact or transfer their conserved water. But they usually identify it based upon the diverted amount of water. You've got states like Washington that does not have anything explicit about the transfer of conserved water, but does say that you're allowed to transfer a portion of the amount of your historic consumptive use. So if you are using less than your historic consumptive use, let's go easy and just say you're transferring from alfalfa to peppers on the same acreage, you may have a fair amount of water that you're no longer using. And if you can demonstrate it to the state that you've got this conserved water, they'll allow you to put it on other acreage, lease it to somebody else, use it for municipal purposes, whatever the case may be. Yikes. So I'll stop there. I'll certainly open up for Q&A at the end if you have further questions about that. But there are a number of states that have started to enter this realm of what you can do with conserved water. And the Environmental Law Institute did a report a few years ago with American Rivers and the Alliance for Water Efficiency that was looking at the Colorado River Basin states and what the states allow and don't allow legally, both in terms of the water conservation and in-stream flow protections. And so how you might be able to marry conservation and in-stream flows. So determining the historic consumptive use takes time and money, engineers, lawyers. It can be very contentious. But again, it's important to protect the right holders, understand all of the potential impacts of a water transfer, or else you may just wind up with a situation where you go through the process, you determine, oh, it's good, people start putting up infrastructure, and then you're going to have lawsuits from third-party interests, other water right holders that wind up undermining the whole process anyway. So when are you going to address these? And streamlining, while it is good, I think it's a great concept, you have to make sure that you're streamlining in a way that's going to be ultimately effective and address the concerns that someone may come back and upend the whole thing anyway later. So without further ado, we'll jump into the examples. So this first one is in Washington, and it basically is a mechanism for effectively expediting this transfer process. The Washington Department of Ecology and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation established the Yakima Emergency Water Bank in 2001 to facilitate short-term transactions to address the 2001 drought. They then established, in order to make this bank really function, a water transfer working group to review those proposed water transfers. Due to its success in 2001, they wound up doing it in 2002, and actually it's now been ongoing ever since in wet years and in dry years. So the group developed transfer guidelines, and so the proposals that the group unanimously found to meet these guidelines received a recommended tag and were sent off to the relevant ultimate authority, whether it was the Yakima County Superior Court or the Washington Department of Ecology, for true approval. It basically has manifested itself in terms of a rubber stamp. Almost 100% of those things, of those proposed transactions that are deemed by the group to be recommended, do indeed get approved by the relevant authority. The group also works with those individuals, often works with those individuals that did not receive a recommended tag to try to identify what it is that they could do to improve in order to receive the recommended tag. And those individuals always can submit it directly to Ecology or the court if they so choose without the recommended tag. Oh, and timeline. This is what's important. Speed. In dry years, they're looking for 15 days from the time that you submit your application to the time that you are given a final, in most cases, an approval. In non-dry years, it's 45 days. For any of you that have worked in transactions, that is crazy fast. So one of the things that really makes this work is, as I mentioned, you have to understand what the third parties are going to be feeling. If there's anybody that's going to more or less try to come back and upend the whole process from the beginning. The group consists of not only the Washington Department of Ecology and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, but hydrologists, water users, and water right experts from around the basin, informally representing a wide variety of interests. So these folks are intelligent, they know the basin, and they know the interests. And so when they say that it's good, and they unanimously say it's good, you can pretty much assume that there's not going to be much of a problem. The members are voluntary, and since there are so many interests effectively represented, the group winds up being pretty accurate in their assessments. Another thing that I want to point out about this example goes back to one of Buzz's comments in terms of the clarity of rights. This basin has been adjudicated, which makes some of this easier. just because they've already been through the process of more or less identifying who has what rights to the water, so there's clarity. One of the other sort of unintended consequences, I think, of that for purposes of the transaction is that people got to know one another, and I guess they didn't hate each other enough after all of it that they're willing to work together, and it has really made it more of a collaborative process in the end. They understood the issues, they had been through the adjudication process, and they understood each other well enough to know what the respective groups were thinking. All right, switching gears a little bit, we're going to California. So this, it's a bit of an unusual example for a long-term agreement, but it's, I think, one that is often put out there, and so I want to highlight it. But before I get into the details of it, I do want to say that there are a lot of long-term agreements that you can come to, and I think the idea there is that if the two parties, three parties, are able to work through the difficult hurdles, the procedural hurdles that happen at the outset, to identify what the historic consumptive use is and to more or less get pre-approval for any transactions. Once any event occurs, whatever you deem that to be, the demand of the lessee or a drought event that's declared by the governor, once that occurs, you're pretty much ready to go. The process isn't going to take all that long. In this case, we're talking about the Palo Verde Irrigation District and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and creating a 35-year long-term agreement for variable water quantity leasing from year to year. So the two parties actually conducted a pilot project back in the early 90s that was quite instrumental in terms of making this agreement well-structured and hopefully fairly long-lasting. Under the agreement, Metropolitan Water District must lease water from at least 6,000 acres of valley land, which roughly equates to about 25,000 acre-feet of water, and may lease water from no more than 26,500 acres of valley land, roughly 118,000 acre-feet of water. As you see there, about 7% of valley lands to 28% of valley lands. In addition to other payments, which I'll get into in a minute, Metropolitan paid each participating farmer $3,170 per acre for enrolling in the program, and pays for an inflation-adjusted rate of per acre fallowed in a given year. It started out at about $602, obviously is more now. So one of the revelations of this pilot project were the economic effects. And during the project, about 52 full-time agricultural jobs were reported to be temporarily lost, and farm-related services also suffered. So Metropolitan, in the 2004 agreement, established a $6 million community improvement fund that is run by a volunteer group in the district. It has basically, Metropolitan has nothing to do with that amount of money, where it's being spent, etc. And the fund has been used to support workforce training. In particular, they had put up a truck driving school, as well as provide business loans and develop community resources. In effect, trying to offset some of these third-party impacts, the loss of economic revenue that comes from the fallowing. In addition, in terms of economic effects, Metropolitan pays the irrigation district for its costs in administering the program. But I think what really makes this work, and is true in most multi-year lease agreements, is that it's adaptable. The amount of water transferred each year depends on Metropolitan's demands, obviously within those constraints that I identified earlier. Plus, the annual compensation for the fallowed acres is adjusted based on inflation, and the payments for administration of the program depend on the expenses each year incurred by the district. I want to stop here real quickly and identify one of the challenges also to this. Basically, the underlying relationships can be delicate, not only when you're putting this together, but also when you're maintaining it over time. And recently, Metropolitan Water District had an opportunity and did buy up some lands in the valley, which, as you might imagine, has made some of the farmers in the area a little unsettled, and I don't think it'll necessarily upend any of this, but it casts a little bit of doubt in terms of its sustainability and also what might happen after the expiration of the agreement. But I think for the farmers, a lot of it was with this agreement that there's a cap to it, and they don't want to be Owens Valley, which we talked about earlier. They don't want to see all of their water gone to municipal uses. And so this additional purchasing is a little bit more of the camel's nose under the tent and can be disconcerting. So even when you've got something that's this well constructed, I think there's a continued recognition of the need to foster those underlying relationships, and that there is goodwill between the respective parties. I think it's almost mandatory whenever we talk about transfers that somehow water banking makes its way into the conversation. So I picked an example of that. I'm going with the Idaho State Water Supply Bank. There are a lot of other ones that we could use for these purposes, but it is one of the more successful examples, and most states have had some go at creating a water bank of some form. So they're with a fairly checkered past across the West. And there are a lot of factors that really make a difference in terms of whether these things succeed or fail. Some of them wind up being drought-related, temporary banks. Some of them wind up being more long-term banks. But the Idaho Water Resources Board is the one that actually runs the bank, and one of the elements that has really made this work is the fact that the water transaction process is a little less onerous when you're going through the bank because there are a handful of procedures that are not required through that process as compared to the normal process for transfers. So one of the other incentives that has been really important to this is goes back to the idea of forfeiture. And in 2002, the Idaho legislature made it so that just depositing your water right in the bank exempted you from the forfeiture doctrine. This, you didn't have to lease it. It didn't matter what happened to the water once it was in there, but just putting it in there was all that was necessary to receive that protection. And as a result, we've seen a high number of water rights that have been deposited in the bank every year, and a lot of people attribute that success to this provision. Another element of the bank that's been really important, and one of the things that actually winds up tanking a lot of banks over time, is their ability to be fiscally sound. In some cases, you may have the government that winds up putting up the original expense for running the bank. Inevitably, there are some costs that are incurred. But the challenge that you face as any bank is, why would anybody pay you to run through your process when they may just be able to use you as a bulletin board? And a lot of banks have failed because of that. More or less, if you're able to identify another if you're a seller and you're looking for a buyer, you're able to identify that buyer, and you guys go off on the side and you work through your transaction. How do you overcome that? You have to create some form of an incentive, and both through the forfeiture doctrine and through these expedited procedures, this bank has been able to do so. But it only received 10% of the lease price from any transaction. And that was insufficient to actually cover their full costs. So in 2011, the Idaho legislature approved a $250 lease application fee, which, as you can imagine, if there are a lot of people that may be putting their water right into the bank for purposes of protecting it from forfeiture, that there may not be a lease out. This at least gets them some funding for anyone that is putting their water into the bank for that purpose. And as a result of this change, they've been quite fiscally sound since. Finally, and very quickly, data collection and management. The bank uses a GIS-based data management system and differentiates parts of a rental fee, and then as a result, this information is more accessible and management is more streamlined. Okay. This example was actually teed up originally by Doug. He mentioned the Colorado Big Thompson project. And Buzz provided an example of this type of transaction when he was mentioning the Westlands Water District and the ability to operate within the district in terms of transactions. They're not your traditional state water right prior appropriation problem in that they're dealing with water rights of a slightly different nature. In the case of Westlands, it's that they're all under one single water right. In the case of CBT, it's foreign water, and I'll explain that in a second. So the Colorado Big Thompson project brings water from the headwaters of the Colorado Basin across the Continental Divide, as you can see in the picture here, to the Front Range of Colorado, and has made possible this active, long-standing, and often referenced water market. Part of the reason for the activity of this market is the extent of the infrastructure and hence the geographic range of the system. With 95 miles of canals, 35 miles of tunnels, 12 reservoirs, 65 miles north to south, 150 miles east to west, you're covering a lot of territory. And the project also covers not just ag lands but also municipal lands. So in many cases, as we've been discussing, you've got your customary buyers and your customary sellers, or lessees and lessors. But probably the most defining feature of this is that it's a homogeneous commodity, and it makes it highly transferable. So the nature of it stems from the fact that under Colorado water law, foreign water can be used to extinction. And basically, you don't have to worry about those things that we were looking at before in terms of return flows, that your right is your right to that water. The units, it's not a water right, but the water users have units which are rights to a pro rata share of available water each year, as opposed to, again, the first in time, first in right. So when Northern determines how much water they're going to have in that year, you're getting each unit receives a percentage of that amount of water. Another aspect of this that's really important is that it's a single authority. So Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District is that sole authority over water transfers, and the buyers and the sellers are all within that basin. So as a result, they really run everything. They're quite independent. They don't have to worry about those outside of the basin, and they can develop these transactions programs with a very little cost. For the most part, it's not a whole lot more than a bulletin board. And some very basic concluding points. So why a system or mechanism exists and operates the way that it does is as important as what the system or mechanism is and what changes might be made. Again, thinking about these other factors, what influences it? You may have something great, and honestly, water law is riddled with this. Really wonderful things that haven't gone anywhere. And you can have those same things be put in another place and they work beautifully. These other factors are really important. So before you go forward and start thinking about what to change, think about why the current system exists and build off of that in terms of thinking about your changes. Simplifying the transfer process. So it's important to do that. I mean, I don't want to suggest that streamlining is a bad thing, but you have to consider those potential consequences to third-party interests. It can be environment, it can be other water right users. Colorado has had a difficult time over the last decade, 2 decades, with this concept of buy and dry, that you have pictures of ghost towns, former farming communities that make the front page of the paper, and politically that doesn't sit very well, and you have to start changing how you do things. So these third-party impacts, no matter how they come back to get you, they probably will. You have to keep those in mind no matter what the process is that you're going through. And then finally, there are many water transfer mechanisms out there. We've scratched the surface with a few of them here. I'm hoping in Q&A we might get to a few others. I know I didn't touch on anything with regard to transferring water to environmental purposes. I'm glad to talk about that if anybody has questions on that regard. But it's important to tailor these mechanisms to the circumstances that you're in order to make sure that they're going to actually do what you hope that they do. And I think that's how you actually make them work. Thank you.